her life was stolen. Her life was stolen. And in such a horrible way. I made a promise to her at her grave that I would see that justice was done. I didn't really know how I would carry out that promise, but that's the last thing I could do for her.
It was a warm Thursday afternoon on May 31st, 1984, when a farmer made a gruesome discovery in his field near a quarry in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Police arrived at the scene and found the body of 18-year-old Laura Salmon. The ruthless manner of the young woman's death sent shockwaves through the community. Despite a wealth of circumstantial evidence and a number of possible suspects, the case eventually went cold. It would take another 16 years before DNA testing provided investigators with enough evidence to finally nab her killer. Was Laura murdered by a random killer? Or was this the work of someone she knew personally? Hello and welcome back to M7 Crime Storytime, where we cover solved, unsolved, and twisted cases from around the world. Today we dive into the twisted case of Laura Salmon. But before we delve any further, please take the time to show your support by subscribing to our channel, liking our videos, and clicking on the bell icon to receive notifications of our latest videos. Without further delay, let's dive into another crime mystery. The city of Murfreesboro in Tennessee once served as the state capital for 8 years until that title was awarded to Nashville in 1826. Today, with a population of 153,000 residents, it remains the county seat of Rutherford County and the largest suburb of Nashville, Tennessee. It's an agricultural town with some of its main exports being corn, cotton, and tobacco. Murfreesboro is also known for its high-performing academic institutions, most notably Middle Tennessee State University, or MTSU. When it comes to crime, Murfreesboro's violent crime rates rank lower than the national average, and its property crime rates are on par with cities of its size. As one of Tennessee's fastest-growing cities, it still remains a place where many have chosen to call home and raise a family in. In 1984, Laura Salmon was a freshman in Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro when she met a tragic end. Born on October 6, 1965, Laura Lee Salmon was the only child of Lorene and John Salmon. Even as a child, Laura was so charming and popular that she was crowned Little Miss Murfreesboro in preschool. As she grew up, she was often described as the girl next door. During the summers, she participated in various theater productions hosted by the Murfreesboro Little Theater. Laura's parents divorced when she was quite young, but they remained on friendly terms with each other and co-parented their daughter. Laura excelled academically and graduated with honors from Oakland High School in 1983. She was also a member of the Flag Corps while in high school. In the fall of 1983, she started attending Middle Tennessee State University. At the same time, Laura began working at the Kroger grocery store in Murfreesboro with her childhood friend Trina Daniel. Laura was also in a relationship with high school senior Kyle Gilley, whom she'd met in 1982. Though he was a year younger than Laura, the couple maintained their relationship even after she graduated from high school. Like any young woman her age, Laura was enjoying her time in college surrounded by friends and making plans for an exciting future. Unfortunately, all the promise and potential of her life was soon cut short by a ruthless killer. On the afternoon of Thursday, May 31st, 1984, local farmer Johnny Muckle was walking around his farm when he noticed a pile of clothes in one of his fields. Upon further inspection, he realized it was the body of a young woman. Immediately, he drove down to the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office to report the gruesome discovery. Officers, led by Detective Robert Ashbury, followed Muckle back to his farm and found a young woman lying on her back in the field exactly as described. It was obvious to officers that she was deceased. She'd been covered up by 2 pairs of jeans, one a woman's Sergio Valente and the other a man's wrestler jeans. A sleeve of a black members-only jacket was tied around her neck. In her right hand, she clutched a pair of underwear which officers guessed were her own. The only item of clothing she had on was a bra. The left side of her head showed visible signs of trauma, and several blood-stained rocks were scattered haphazardly near the body. Officers deduced that her attacker had beaten her with the same rocks. The area where the body was discovered was familiar to officers. It was often used by local high school and college students as a venue for parties and bonfires. It was also a well-known lover's lane for young couples. The young woman in the field was also familiar to many of the officers at the crime scene. She was a friendly blonde cashier from the local Kroger grocery store, Laura Salmon. Laura's body was taken to the Rutherford County mortuary to await an autopsy. Meanwhile, officers visited Laura's parents, Laureen and John, separately. At the time of her murder, Laura had just moved in with her father and stepmother, Brenda. Laura's mother, Laureen, was devastated by the news, but she immediately pointed the finger at Laura's boyfriend, 17-year-old Kyle Gilly. Laureen, who was an English teacher at Oakland's high school that Kyle attended, had heard rumors of his behavior that made her uneasy. She went on to tell officers that Laura and Kyle had a toxic relationship. Kyle was known to be possessive and jealous and often treated Laura badly. Laureen told officers that she never approved of the couple's relationship and had told her daughter to end things with Kyle. It had come to a point where Laura had constantly stressed out about her relationship. Laureen and several family members had urged Laura to take out a restraining order against Kyle after he'd started to become violent with her. Laureen had gone as far as to forbid Kyle from coming to their house while Laura lived with her. Officers were starting to suspect Kyle Gilly based on Laureen's concerns, but it didn't prove that he was the killer. They needed to find out more. Next, officers visited Laura's father, John, and his wife, Brenda. Both John and Brenda said they'd last seen Laura on the morning of May 31st, 1984. She'd gone out the previous night with her friend Trina Daniel, and both girls had ended up sleeping in the family den. Nothing had seemed off when Laura got ready and left with Trina on the morning of May 31st for her 9 a.m. shift at Kroger's. Following these interviews, Laura's boyfriend, Kyle Gilly, arrived at the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office in the evening. Kyle told officers he'd called Laura's father, who said he needed to go down to the sheriff's office to give a statement about Laura. He spoke to Deputy Chief Robert Asbury, who informed Kyle of Laura's murder. Kyle told Asbury that he last saw Laura on Wednesday, May 30th, 1984, at her grandmother's house. They'd been together from 6:30 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. They'd made some plans to go swimming the next afternoon at her grandmother's house, but he said she never showed up. It was only after he called her father that he figured out something was wrong. Deputy Asbury didn't take down a formal statement from Kyle as he was underage and allowed him to leave. While officers worked on questioning Laura's family about her movements up until her death, Sergeant Ralph Lehue had a hunch. He knew Laura worked at Kroger's and that no one had been able to locate her car yet. He was on patrol duty the night that Laura's body was discovered and decided to drive by the Kroger store on Tennessee Boulevard. His hunch paid off. At 12:40 a.m. on June 1st, 1984, he found a two-toned beige 1976 Oldsmobile Cutlass Salon in the Kroger parking lot. It was Laura's car. The car, along with soil samples and the evidence discovered at the crime scene, was sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, or TBI, for testing. As investigators waited for the results, they worked on building a timeline of events leading to Laura's murder. They visited the Kroger store to speak with Trina Daniels, Laura's best friend. Trina told officers that Laura had picked her up from work at 11 p.m. on Wednesday, May 30th, 1984. They then went to a nightclub in Nashville and returned to Laura's father's house at around 3:30 a.m. The next morning, on May 31st, Trina had taken a lift with Laura to the store. While Laura began her shift at 9 a.m., Trina had made her way to her own home because she was working a later shift. Trina told officers that when she arrived at work shortly after 1 p.m. that day, she didn't see Laura's car at the usual spot. However, sometime between 3 p.m. and 3:30 p.m., while helping a customer carry out groceries, she'd seen Laura's car parked in a different spot. Investigators then questioned Sybil Waite, who was Laura's supervisor, and Sharon Falk, who had worked the morning shift with Laura the day she died. Both women confirmed that Laura had left early to go swimming at her grandmother's house. During the course of these interviews, more details emerged about Laura and Kyle's troubled relationship. Sharon told investigators that she'd once advised Laura to seek help after noticing black and blue bruising on her face. Trina added that Laura had confided in her about dating other men while at university and begged her to keep it a secret. Laura was afraid of Kyle's reaction if he found out. This information added a new surprise and shocking complication to the investigation. Although Kyle seemed like the most likely suspect, the fact that Laura was dating freely meant that anyone could be a suspect at this point. On June 2, 1984, Tennessee State Medical Examiner Dr. Charles Harlan performed Laura's autopsy. In his report, he determined that Laura had died due to blunt force trauma to her head, possibly caused by a heavy rock. She'd received a total of 10 blows to different parts of her head, resulting in a spiderweb pattern of skull fractures, as cold case detective Dan Goodwin explained in a television interview. Her left eye had also been discolored, which Dr. Harlan determined was the result of a fist to her face. Dr. Harlan also examined Laura for signs of assault. He deduced that Laura had been intimate with a partner 24 to 48 hours prior to her death. The act was determined to be consensual and not forced, as pointed out by the District Attorney General in a televised documentary. Interestingly enough, the biological sample taken from Laura did not match with the sample found on the men's wrestler's jeans from the crime scene. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation partnered with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to test Laura's car. There were no fingerprints in the car, not even Laura's. This led investigators to believe that the killer had wiped down the vehicle carefully. What they did find was a single foreign hair that they kept for testing. Through microscopic analysis, the dirt found on the mats inside the car and the fender matched the mud on the road located near the crime scene. On Monday, June 4, 1984, Laura was laid to rest at the Coleman Cemetery in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The funeral was attended by close friends and family who paid tribute to the bubbly young woman they remembered. Also present at the funeral was Laura's close friend from university, Dan Goodwin, who'd been to the movies with Laura just 4 days before her death. Goodwin promised Laura's mother, Lorene, that he would find her killer no matter how long it took. Lorene, too, made that promise to her deceased daughter.
I made a promise to her at her grave that I would see that justice was done. I didn't really know how I would carry out that promise, but that's the last thing I could do for her.
Investigators worked through their notes they'd collected over the course of several interviews with Laura's family members and friends. By this time, investigators felt strongly that Kyle might know more than he was telling them. On June 6, 1984, 17-year-old Kyle was summoned to the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office for an interview. Kyle, being underage, was accompanied by a stepfather during the questioning. Kyle was read his Miranda rights before investigators took a formal statement from him. He told investigators that he'd met Laura at around 6:30 p.m. on Wednesday, May 30, 1984, at her grandmother's house. At around 9 p.m., the two of them had left in his car and driven to Bellwood Church in Murfreesboro. Kyle explained that he parked his car behind the church before being intimate with Laura. Afterwards, he dropped her back at her grandmother's house. Kyle told investigators that he drove off to work a night shift and assumed Laura had driven back to her father's house. He returned from work at around 7 a.m. on May 31st and went to sleep. Kyle told detectives he didn't wake up until 3 or 4 p.m. His statement was backed up by Kyle's stepfather, who told investigators that he'd seen Kyle sleeping when he came home from work around 3 p.m. The stepfather added that the only time Kyle left home was when Laura's father, John Salmon, told him something had happened to Laura and he needed to go to the sheriff's office. Investigators were still suspicious of Kyle because he was the only one with a strong motive. But so far, his story and alibi had checked out. A month later, in July 1984, TBI agent Tom Carmouche decided to interview Kyle again. Kyle told Agent Carmouche that he'd been to Florida until May 29, 1984. He then repeated the story he told investigators during his June interview. This time, however, he added a new detail. He told Carmouche that after he and Laura had been intimate, they cleaned themselves up using an old pair of his jeans. Yet Kyle denied being involved in Laura's murder, and his stepfather's alibi helped solidify his claims. Without enough evidence to link Kyle to the murder, he was released, much to the disappointment of Laura's mother, Lorene. But investigators were about to find another lead in the case. While putting together a timeline of Laura's movements, investigators received a call from a woman in Nashville, Tennessee. The woman, who wanted to remain anonymous, alleged that she'd been assaulted by a man named John Taylor. The woman claimed that Taylor had threatened that if she didn't keep quiet, he'd do the same thing to her as he'd done to Laura Salmon. This unexpected lead turned the investigation in a different direction. Investigators ran a background check on John Taylor and discovered some interesting information. He attended Middle Tennessee State University and was a member of the same gym as Laura. Taylor also frequented the same fraternity parties Laura attended. investigators then questioned people who knew Taylor and discovered that he had a history of violence against former girlfriends. They also learned that Taylor was seen near the MTSU campus on the day Laura was murdered. Taylor was called in for questioning by investigators, but he denied assaulting the woman from Nashville. He also denied being involved in Laura's murder or having mentioned the incident to anyone. To rule him out as a suspect, Taylor was asked to submit a hair sample to compare against the strand found in Laura's car. FBI forensic chemist Patty Choater compared the samples. Although both hair strands were consistent, DNA testing of hair was still years away from making a definitive match. Investigators could not charge Taylor without strong evidence. The next step was to compare the man's jeans found at the crime scene with the jeans used by Taylor. The jeans retrieved from the crime scene had a waist size of 30 inches and an inseam of 36 inches, but these measurements were way too long for Taylor to use on a daily basis. With no strong evidence, investigators released Taylor and ruled him out as a suspect in Laura's murder. Over 100 men were interviewed in the course of the investigation that year, but all were cleared after their alibis checked out. Whoever killed Laura Salmon seemed to have simply vanished into thin air. With no new leads, Laura's case started to grow cold by the end of 1985. However, years later, when new investigators looked over the cold case files, several issues started to emerge. The new investigators discovered that the crime scene had not been properly secured and that evidence had been handled without the use of gloves. It was noted that John Salmon, Laura's father, was the person who found her necklace at the crime scene and discovered more rocks covered in blood. He'd handed these items to investigators, possibly compromising the evidence due to faulty handling. It was also noted that officers had never taken a formal statement from Johnny Muckle, the farmer who discovered Laura's body. No explanation was ever given for the lack of proper police work. It was the year 2000 that Laura's case started to heat up again. Laura's friend Dan Goodwin, who'd promised Laura's mother that he'd find her killer, was about to come through with his pledge. He'd taken a much longer route than expected. The first cold case Goodwin received was Laura's, and for this he was partnered with Sergeant Bill Sharp. Their first task was to send all the evidence from the case to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for DNA testing. In addition to Laura's DNA, 2 unknown DNA profiles were recovered from the men's rustler's jeans and from Laura's clothes. This time around, forensic testing had advanced to the point where DNA profiles from the crime scene could be compared with samples to identify the owner. At the same time, detectives were about to stumble upon another unexpected piece of information. They received another interesting tip. A 16-year-old student from Oakland High School had reportedly claimed that his father was the man who'd murdered Laura Salmon. Armed with the DNA profiles, Goodwin and Sharp got to work quickly. The detectives discovered that the boy's father had a criminal record for aggravated assault. They were able to track down their suspect, a man named David Patterson. But by the time they heard of the rumor, Patterson had been shot and killed in an unrelated incident. Instead, the detectives turned to Patterson's children and asked them to submit DNA samples for testing. In the end, their DNA did not match any of the samples extracted from Laura's body or the men's jeans. This ruled out Patterson. Investigators started looking through the case files and the original suspect list. They contacted John Taylor, one of the earlier suspects, who volunteered his DNA for testing. His DNA didn't match any of the samples from the crime scene. In order to ensure transparent police procedure, Detective Dan Goodwin also submitted a DNA sample, as he too had gone on a date with Laura just days before her murder. He was cleared of any suspicion in the murder. But there was still one suspect that investigators were keen on looking up. That was Kyle Gilley. Goodwin and Sharp received Laura's case file looking for any information that may have been overlooked by other investigators. It was at that moment a truly unbelievable piece of evidence came to their notice. They found a curious note about a possible witness who contradicted Kyle Gilley's alibi. Goodwin and Sharp tracked down the witness, Gladys Mears, who still lived in Murfreesboro. Their interview with Gladys was about to blow their cold case wide open. Gladys told investigators that while driving home on the afternoon of Laura's murder, she'd seen a 2-toned beige Oldsmobile Cutlass at the intersection of Twin Oak and Halls Pike. She remembered the car was on the road that led away from the quarry where Laura's body was eventually discovered. She recalled waiting for the car to move first, but the driver was just sitting there. She eventually cut ahead and proceeded through the intersection, but managed to get a good look at the driver of the Oldsmobile. The next day, she learned about Laura's mother through news articles and television reports. Gladys told several co-workers about what she'd seen the previous afternoon. They advised her to speak to investigators. She then visited the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office and informed officers that she'd seen the young man from the newspaper driving the victim's car the same afternoon of the murder. Gladys told Goodwin and Sharp that a few months later she'd been interviewed again by Agent Carmouche, who provided her with a photo lineup. She'd picked out Kyle Gilley instantly. According to Gladys, it was the driver's behavior that made an impression on her. He appeared to be staring straight ahead with a blank expression on his face. Armed with this new information that had somehow got lost among the pages of the case file, Goodwin and Sharp started building a profile of Kyle Gilley. They re-interviewed old witnesses and discovered some new ones as their investigation progressed. Some witnesses said that Kyle had stalked Laura around the MTSU campus and even physically assaulted her in the dormitory. The detectives also learned that Kyle had exhibited strange behavior after Laura's death. A new witness, Shelley Davenport, told investigators that when she ignored Kyle's advances, he'd asked her if she wanted to end up like Laura. When she asked who Laura was, he'd openly told her that she was his ex-girlfriend and that he'd killed her.
He would get mad at her, grab her by the head, and start banging her head into cars, school lockers, whatever was at hand. He would punch her. On one occasion, he broke out both of her front teeth.
Forensic analysts at the TBI Crime Laboratory also worked hard to find enough evidence that could prove the person wearing the Rustler jeans was the person who had attacked and killed Laura. The blood on the jeans was tested against Laura's DNA and came back as a positive match. The pattern of blood splatter also indicated that whomever attacked Laura had been wearing the jeans and kneeling next to her at the time of the crime. It also indicated that a blunt instrument like a rock was likely used because the blows had not generated much force. All analysts needed now was to find a match to the biological material found on the jeans. Goodwin and Sharp focused on tracking down Kyle, who had relocated to Florida in 1986. On May 9, 2000, the detectives made contact with Sergeant Rich Gherkin at the Manatee County Sheriff's Office in Florida. Gherkin reviewed the background information on Laura's case before calling Kyle in for an interview. Once again, Kyle denied having anything to do with Laura's murder and even denied being intimate with her before her death. Kyle was served a warrant for his blood sample, which was sent off to the TBI Forensic Lab for testing. On May 31, 2000, the 16th anniversary of Laura Salmon's death, the DNA sample of Kyle Gilley positively matched the biological sample found on the Rustler jeans at the crime scene. It linked Kyle to the crime scene and proved that he was most likely the person who had killed Laura. On November 13, 2001, Dan Goodwin flew to Florida to interview Kyle. From the outset, Kyle denied being violent to Laura or visiting her on the MTSU campus. He only admitted that the Rustler jeans may have been his. Goodwin knew Kyle was lying about everything. Goodwin himself had seen Kyle several times on campus with Laura. He was able to get on record all the denials made by Kyle during their interview. When Goodwin told Kyle that he had an expert who could testify that Laura's killer had been wearing the very same pair of Rustler jeans, Kyle asked for an attorney, which subsequently ended the interview. Finally, on November 14, 2001, Kyle Gilley was arrested for the murder of Laura Salmon. Because Kyle had been under the age of 18 at the time of Laura's murder, he was arraigned in juvenile court instead of a criminal court. A hearing was held in 2002 to determine whether his case should be transferred to the adult circuit court. On February 1, 2002, following several witness statements regarding the violent relationship between Laura and Kyle, juvenile court judge Donna Scott ruled that Kyle would be indicted as an adult. On March 6, 2002, a grand jury indicted Kyle of first-degree murder charges. It would take another 4 years for Kyle's trial to begin, as prosecution and defense attorneys argued back and forth over which witness testimony should be allowed in the final hearing. On July 26, 2006, Kyle Gilley's trial for the murder of Laura Salmon began in the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals.
I'm telling you today that I am a mother who keeps her promises.
I told them why I thought it was him, or why I knew it was him. And I was very frustrated that they didn't take that seriously.
The prosecution provided witness statements that proved Kyle had exhibited violent behavior towards Laura and often threatened her life. They also used forensic evidence and eyewitness statements to prove that Kyle had been present at the crime scene. According to the prosecution, Kyle had likely attacked Laura in a fit of rage and jealousy when she tried to end their relationship. Kyle's defense, however, tried to dispel their theories by stating that another unknown male DNA sample had been found on the victim. His defense team also highlighted the alibi provided by his stepfather, who had seen Kyle sleeping at home on the afternoon of Laura's murder. This alibi was backed up by Kyle's stepbrother, Michael Powell, who said he'd also seen Kyle sleeping in their home at the time of Laura's murder. But when Michael was cross-examined by prosecutors, it emerged that he'd written a letter to Kyle in prison. Michael admitted that in the letter he promised Kyle he'd provide him with an alibi at the trial. In September 2006, Kyle Gilley was found guilty of first-degree murder. According to the 1984 state sentencing laws, Kyle was sentenced to 30 years in prison. In 2008, Kyle appealed his conviction to the Court of Criminal Appeals. The court, however, upheld his original conviction. He'll be eligible for parole on September 25, 2042. It took over 20 years for Laura Salmon's family to finally see justice served on her behalf.
When Kyle Gilley is eligible for his first parole hearing in September of 2042, I'll be 83 years old. But if I'm alive, and if my partner Bill Sharp's alive, we'll be there to testify against releasing him.
It took smart investigative work and technological advancements to piece together the puzzle that had plagued Rutherford County investigators for decades. Today's case also brings to the forefront the reality of intimate partner violence and highlights the signs we should all look out for in the people closest to us. But the question remains, how did the initial investigators not see through the lies of Kyle Gilley from the outset? And why did they ignore a witness statement that contradicted Kyle's alibi from way back in 1984? Please let us know your thoughts and views in the comment section below. Also, please remember to subscribe to our channel, like our videos, and share them with like-minded crime enthusiasts. If you have any crime story suggestions, feel free to leave us a message in the comment section below. Until next time, stay safe.